There is a story you have been told since childhood, a story so foundational, its first words are etched into the memory of civilization itself. It begins with a thunderous declaration of order, a divine command that brings forth reality from nothingness. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It feels safe. It feels absolute. It feels like the solid ground upon which everything else is built. But the very next breath shatters the calm. The very next sentence refuses to cooperate with our desire for a perfect start. It whispers something unsettling, something that doesn't belong, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. We are taught to read these words as poetry, to see them as the beautiful description of a blank canvas, the raw, unshaped material waiting for the master artist's touch. But I want you to stop, right here, and listen. Listen not with the ears of a student in a classroom, but with the instincts of a detective standing at a crime scene. Because these words, they don't describe a blank canvas. They describe the aftermath. In the ancient Hebrew tongue, the phrase is tohu wa bohu, a term so devastatingly specific. It's used elsewhere in the scriptures only by prophets to describe the horrifying ruin left behind after God's judgment has swept through a land. It is never the language of creation. It is the language of wreckage. It is the vocabulary of a world unmade. So let's re-examine the scene. The darkness isn't the gentle dark before a dawn. It's the oppressive shadow that falls after a cataclysm. The silence isn't the quiet of an empty room waiting to be filled. It's the heavy, echoing stillness after something has been violently broken. This is not a world in the process of being born. This is a world that is already wounded. This isn't the beginning of the story. You have walked onto the stage in Act 2. And so, the first and most forbidden question of our investigation arises. What happened in Act 1? What crime was so immense that it left creation shattered before Adam ever took his first breath? The opening lines of our Bible are not a birth certificate. They are a police report, describing a scene of profound devastation, a scar etched onto the very first page of history. Tonight, we are not here to simply retell the story you know. We are here to investigate the story that was silenced. Together, we will peel back the comfortable veil of poetry and search for the fingerprints left at the scene. We will look for the evidence of what came before and for the motive behind why it was erased. So, our investigation begins at a scene of cosmic devastation, a world unmade before it was remade. But every crime scene raises a critical question: who were the perpetrators? What was the motive? Most inquiries into this ancient mystery stop at one convenient and, frankly, sensational answer. An answer pieced together from fragmented clues left much later in the Book of Genesis, a few cryptic verses in chapter 6 that speak of the sons of God seeing the daughters of men, taking them as wives, and birthing a race of giants. The official story, the one you've likely heard, is this: the world before Adam was corrupted by a rebellion born of lust. Angels, overcome by carnal desire, abandoned their heavenly posts, defiled humanity, and filled the earth with such violence that God had no choice but to wash it all away. It's a compelling narrative. It's a story of passion, pride, and a clear moral failing. It's simple, it's dramatic, and it has served for centuries as a perfect explanation. And every good investigator knows to be deeply suspicious of a perfect explanation. Let's put on our detective's hat again. Does the punishment truly fit the alleged crime? We are talking about an act of judgment so total, so absolute, that it required the decreation of a world, the undoing of the very fabric of reality. Are we to believe that this cosmic reboot was triggered solely by a sin of the flesh? However grievous it feels, disproportionate, it's like blaming the catastrophic collapse of an entire empire on a single, scandalous affair in the royal court. The affair might be true, it might be part of the story, but it conveniently distracts us from the deeper, systemic rot that brought the foundations crashing down. What if the story of lust and giants isn't the whole truth? What if it's a red herring, a deliberately simplified narrative handed down by the gatekeepers of history, because the real crime was something far more abstract, far more fundamental, and infinitely more dangerous to their own systems of control? A story about lust is easy to manage. It's a moral lesson we can all understand. But a story about a crime against the very structure of reality itself, a story about a violation of cosmic law, that is a truth far wilder, far more difficult to contain. This is the point where most investigations turn cold. They accept the easy answer and close the file. But we will not. We will treat this official story not as a conclusion, but as a distorted testimony from a witness under duress. It's a version of events that has been cleaned up, simplified, and made safe for public consumption. To find what's been redacted, to hear the part of the testimony that was struck from the record, we have to find a witness they thought they had silenced forever. We have to open a file that was sealed and buried, hoping no one would ever have the courage to look inside. To find the truth of what happened in Act 1, we cannot rely on the official sanitized records. We must go deeper. We must venture into the archives of the forgotten, to a place where documents too dangerous for the canon were laid to rest. Our search leads us to a scroll, a testimony so potent that for millennia it was deliberately buried, suppressed, and dismissed as heresy. We must call to the stand a witness who was not just present at the creation, but who recorded its deepest secrets. This witness is not a man, but a book, the Book of Jubilees. Now, before we examine its testimony, let's establish its credentials. This is not some obscure fan fiction text written centuries after the fact. The Book of Jubilees, also known as the Lesser Genesis, was revered as sacred scripture by the very community that preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. It is still part of the official biblical canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, a living, breathing testament to a stream of faith that refused to forget. It was quoted by the earliest church fathers, respected as a source of profound, ancient wisdom. But its most audacious claim is its origin. This is not a human memory. According to its own text, the Book of Jubilees is a direct transcription. It is the history of heaven and earth, dictated by an angel of the presence to Moses himself, high on the summit of Mount Sinai. During those 40 days and nights when he was hidden in the cloud of God's glory. Think about that for a moment. This book claims to be the celestial commentary on Genesis, the director's cut, filled with the scenes and motivations that were left on the cutting room floor of the version you know. It is the operating manual for the universe. And this brings us to the central question of our entire investigation. A text of such sacred origin, such historical weight. A book considered the word of an angel by the keepers of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Why was it erased from your Bible? What truth does it contain that was deemed so volatile, so disruptive, that the later councils of men, the self-appointed gatekeepers of faith, made the deliberate decision to seal it away in a tomb of silence? They did not fear it because it was false. They feared it because of the devastating power of its truth. They knew that if its central revelation ever came to light, it would not just add to our understanding of the past, it would fundamentally challenge the very foundations of how we practice our faith today. And in the heart of this silenced testimony, we find the first clue to the real crime that shattered the world before Adam. It's a clue that has nothing to do with lust and everything to do with something far more powerful. For generations, we have been conditioned to believe that the first crime, the original sin, was an act of disobedience that took place in a garden, a forbidden fruit, a talking serpent, a choice made by man and woman. That story, as we know it, is about the fall of humanity. But the testimony of our silenced witness, the Book of Jubilees, compels us to rewind the tape further. It takes us back before the garden, before Adam was even formed from the dust, to the wreckage of Tohu Wabohu, and it lays before us the evidence of a crime far more fundamental. A crime not against humanity, but against the very architecture of reality itself, because this angelic record reveals that the first and truest victim of that primordial rebellion was not a person. It wasn't Adam. It wasn't Eve. The first victim was time itself. More specifically, the victim was the calendar of God, a divine, perfect, and unchanging cosmic clock. Genesis gives us the 7 days of creation, a foundational week. But it remains strangely silent on the larger system that governs the months, the seasons, the years. It gives us a starting point, but not the full blueprint. The Book of Jubilees, however, lays that blueprint bare. It speaks with absolute authority of a celestial calendar, a rhythm set in place by the Creator from the beginning. This was not a human invention. It was the heartbeat of creation, a sacred architecture woven into the movements of the sun and the stars. It describes a year of precisely 364 days. Stop and consider the perfection of that design. 364 is a number divisible by 7. That means exactly 52 weeks. No leftover days, no drift. The seasons begin on the same day. Every year, the holy feasts and appointed times, the Sabbaths and the Jubilees, fall with the unerring precision of a celestial machine. It was a system of perfect harmony, a divine symphony where heaven and earth were perfectly synchronized. This calendar wasn't just a way to count days. It was the very essence of God's covenant of order, a tangible expression of His unchanging nature. It was the rhythm to which the entire universe was meant to dance. So, we have identified the victim, a perfect, divinely engineered system of time. A cosmic clock ticking with the flawless rhythm of the Creator's own design. Every priceless mechanism requires a guardian. Every sacred order needs a protector. Who then was entrusted with this monumental responsibility? Who was assigned the sacred duty of safeguarding this celestial rhythm and ensuring that the newly formed earth remained in perfect sync with the courts of heaven? The answer brings us back to those enigmatic figures from the old, distorted story, the Watchers. But now, through the lens of the Book of Jubilees, we see them in a completely new light. The traditional narrative paints them as wayward sentinels, distracted by earthly beauty. But their original commission was infinitely grander. They were not mere gate guards. They were cosmic engineers. They were the appointed guardians of the divine calendar, the custodians of God's appointed times. Imagine their station. They stood outside the flow of human history, observing the great cycles of creation. Their purpose was not to rule humanity, but to instruct it in this divine order. They were the elder brothers tasked with teaching Adam's descendants how to read the stars, not for fortune-telling, but for worship. They were meant to show mankind how to align their lives, their festivals, their planting, and their rest with the perfect and unchanging timetable of heaven. Their role was essential, for in God's design, keeping this calendar was not an arbitrary ritual. It was the primary act of covenant loyalty. To honor the appointed times was to remain in harmony with the Creator. To abandon them was to step out of sync, to invite the very chaos, the tohu wabohu, that had once been subdued. The Watchers were the thin celestial line between cosmic order and primordial chaos. They held in their hands the metronome that kept the symphony of creation playing in perfect harmony. Theirs was not a duty of power, but of precision, a duty of loyalty not just to a king, but to his clock. And it is in the betrayal of this sacred trust, this specific and foundational duty, that we find the true genesis of the fall. The crime was not simply that they looked down upon the earth, it was that they took their eyes off of the heavens. Now that we have our witness, our victim, and our primary suspects, the investigation can truly begin. We will now examine the evidence piece by piece, starting with the very heart of the crime, the divine calendar itself. To understand the gravity of its desecration, you must first appreciate the sheer perfection of its design. Let's set aside the calendars you know. Forget the lunar cycles that drift and wander, requiring complex calculations and extra months just to keep the seasons from sliding into chaos. Forget the Gregorian calendar with its clumsy leap years, a human patch on a fundamentally imperfect system. Let's imagine, together, the system described in the Book of Jubilees, a system of breathtaking simplicity and divine elegance. The number is 364. Think of it as the master key to creation's architecture. 364 is perfectly divisible by 7. This gives you exactly 52 weeks, every single year. The Sabbath day falls on the same calendar day throughout history. There is no confusion, no drift. Furthermore, the year is divided into 4 seasons, each one containing exactly 13 weeks, and each of those 13 weeks is composed of 2 months of 30 days and a third month of 31 days. This symmetrical pattern repeats 4 times, like a divine fractal, 91 days per season, every year, without fail. In this system, the first day of the new year is always a Wednesday, the very day God created the sun, moon, and stars according to Genesis. The great festivals Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles are no longer floating targets on a lunar whim. They are fixed points in the solar year, anchored to the solstices and equinoxes, locked into the unchanging rhythm of the cosmos itself. This was not a calendar of human convenience. It was a covenant written in the language of mathematics, a testament to a creator who values order, precision, and permanence. It was a system so perfect, so self-correcting, that it needed no human intervention. It didn't require a priesthood to interpret it or a king to decree it. It simply was. It was the factory setting for reality, a direct, unmediated connection between the rhythm of human life and the throne of God, perfection, symmetry, a self-sustaining system that connects humanity directly to the divine rhythm without need for an intermediary. It sounds like a spiritual utopia. So why would a truth so beautiful be considered a threat? Why would a calendar so perfect be buried as if it were a dangerous heresy? To answer that, we have to stop thinking like theologians and start thinking like politicians. We have to think about power. A perfect, unchanging, solar-based calendar has one revolutionary and terrifying quality: it cannot be controlled by men. If the holy days are fixed by the sun and the stars, locked into a permanent and predictable cycle, then no king, no priest, no council can alter them. The authority rests not with an institution on earth, but with the architecture of heaven itself. It decentralizes spiritual authority. It places the keys to the sacred rhythm directly into the hands of every individual who can observe the seasons. Now, consider the alternative: a lunar calendar. A calendar based on the shifting, waxing and waning moon is inherently unstable. It drifts out of sync with the solar year by about 11 days annually. It requires constant human intervention, complex calculations, and the periodic insertion of an entire extra leap month just to keep Passover from drifting into summer. And who gets to decide when that month is added? Who gets to interpret the complex signs? Who holds the power to declare when a holy day truly begins? The priesthood, the religious authorities, the gatekeepers. By replacing the simple, solar perfection of the 364-day calendar with a complex, pliable, lunar-based system, spiritual authority was transferred from the unchanging heavens into the hands of a ruling class on earth. They became the masters of time. They could tell you when to feast, when to fast, when to plant, and when to pay your tithes. Your connection to God was no longer direct. It had to pass through their complex calculations and decrees. This is the dangerous secret hidden within the calendar of God. It is a declaration of spiritual independence for all mankind. Its very existence is a threat to any religious system built on control and institutional authority. And this leads us to the most unsettling question of our investigation yet. If this perfect calendar was the original divine order, then what does that say about the calendars we follow today? Are we, in our sincere worship, unknowingly participating in the legacy of a system that was built to supplant it? Are we celebrating on days chosen by men instead of the days appointed by God? Now we arrive at the heart of the crime. With the motive of control established, we can finally understand the true nature of the Watchers' betrayal. Their rebellion was not a spontaneous act of passion. It was a calculated, strategic act of cosmic sabotage. The Book of Jubilees, our angelic witness, is brutally clear on this point. It reveals that the first and foremost sin of the Watchers was not taking human wives. That was a later symptom, a consequence of a much deeper corruption. Their original crime, the act that truly broke the covenant, was an attack on the divine calendar. They, the appointed guardians of time, deliberately began to teach humanity a corrupted form of knowledge. They revealed the secrets of the sun, moon, and stars not for the purpose of reverent worship, but for the purpose of manipulation. They introduced astrology, the practice of seeking guidance from the celestial bodies instead of from their creator. They taught mankind how to chart the heavens to predict their own fortunes, to choose auspicious days for battle, and to establish their own feast days based on their own authority. They gave humanity the tools to build their own clocks. Imagine the subtlety of this deception. It wasn't an outright denial of God. It was a gradual reprogramming of humanity's internal rhythm. The Watchers didn't tell mankind to stop worshipping, they simply taught them to worship on the wrong days. They encouraged them to observe the new moon, a marker of the lunar calendar, instead of the solstices and equinoxes, the great pillars of God's solar year. They introduced a different beat, a seductive but discordant rhythm that slowly pulled humanity out of sync with heaven. This was the ultimate act of treason. A guardian's duty is to protect the system. Instead, they handed over the master keys to those they were meant to protect and encouraged them to rewrite the source code of reality. The chaos that followed the lawlessness, the violence, the genetic corruption of the Nephilim was the inevitable result of a world that had lost its divine anchor, a world adrift in a sea of broken time. The Watchers didn't just break a rule, they broke the ruler. They shattered the very instrument that measured God's covenant with his creation. This was the true original sin, a metaphysical coup d'etat, an attempt to seize control of the timetable of the universe itself. Every good engineer knows that when the master clock of a complex system fails, it's not just the time that becomes incorrect. The entire system begins to malfunction in unpredictable and catastrophic ways. Processes start and stop at the wrong moments. Safety protocols fail. The inherent order dissolves, and chaos rushes in to fill the void. This is precisely what happened to creation after the Watchers sabotaged the divine calendar. The sin against time was the first domino to fall, and its collapse triggered a chain reaction that brought down every other boundary God had established. Once humanity was unmoored from the sacred rhythm of heaven, they were spiritually adrift. Their moral compass, once calibrated to the unchanging poles of God's appointed times, now spun wildly. The very concepts of sacred and profane began to blur, because the timeline that defined them had been corrupted. It is only in this context of cosmic disorder that the subsequent sins described in Genesis 6 make any sense. The Watchers descending to mate with human women was not the cause of the fall. It was a predictable consequence. They had already broken the ultimate boundary between heaven's order and earth's function. Why wouldn't they then break the boundary between the celestial and the terrestrial, the angelic and the human? They were simply acting in accordance with the new, chaotic rhythm they themselves had introduced. And the Nephilim, their hybrid offspring, were the ultimate physical manifestation of this broken order. They were beings who belonged to neither world, living embodiments of a fractured reality. They were a genetic tohu wa, Bohu, a living violation of the divine principle of separation that is so central to the creation account, the separation of light from dark, of the waters above from the waters below, the widespread violence, the corruption, the earth groaning under the weight of lawlessness. These were not a collection of unrelated moral failings. They were the direct, cascading symptoms of the original disease, a creation that had been fundamentally knocked out of time with its creator. The world wasn't just sinful, it was sick. It was suffering from a cosmic arrhythmia, its heart beating to a broken, demonic rhythm. And there is only one cure for a system so profoundly corrupted. It cannot be repaired. It must be reset. And so, our investigation leads us back to where we started, back to the scar on the first page, back to those haunting words whispered in the darkness before the first light, and the earth was without form and void. Tohu wabohu. When we first stood here, these words were a mystery, a clue to a crime we could not yet name. But now, after examining the testimony of our silenced witness, after identifying the true victim and the original sin, these words no longer sound like a description of raw material. They sound like a verdict. They resonate with the full weight of a judge's final decree. Without form, Tohu is the state of a world that has lost its divine structure, its sacred architecture. What gives creation its form, its boundaries, its laws, its appointed times? When the calendar of God was attacked and the rhythms of reality were shattered, the world lost its form. It became a chaotic mess of competing, discordant energies. And void, bohu, is the spiritual state of a world empty of the Creator's presence. When a creation deliberately steps out of sync with its Creator's heartbeat, it severs the very connection that gives it life and meaning. It becomes an empty vessel, a hollow shell where the spirit of order no longer dwells. Tohu wabohu, then, is not the before of creation. It is the after of a rebellion. It is the precise technical term for a system that has suffered a catastrophic failure due to its operators deliberately ignoring the manufacturer's divine specifications. It is the image of a grand celestial symphony hall after the orchestra has smashed their instruments and torn up the sheet music, leaving behind only a cacophony of echoing silence and broken strings. The darkness on the face of the deep was not the absence of light. It was the presence of judgment. And the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters was not a painter contemplating a blank canvas. It was a rescuer surveying the wreckage, a divine medic assessing the damage before beginning the long, arduous process of resuscitation. The world wasn't waiting to be made. It was waiting to be saved. With this new understanding of the crime, we must now re-examine the judgment, the Great Flood. The story is one of the most famous and terrifying in human history, but our investigation demands we look past the surface narrative of punishment and see the strategic necessity behind it. Here, we must call upon our two witnesses and place their testimonies side by side. Witness A, the Book of Genesis, gives us the powerful, ground-level account. It is the testimony of Noah, a man of flesh and blood. He sees the wickedness of humanity. He hears God's sorrow. He feels the first drops of rain. He witnesses the rising waters, the terror, The destruction. Genesis tells us what happened. It shows us the physical cleansing of a world drowning in its own corruption. It is a story of survival and divine wrath. Witness B, the Book of Jubilees, provides the celestial perspective. It is the testimony of the angel, who sees not just the sin on the earth, but the brokenness in the heavens. This witness understands that the corruption is not just moral, it is systemic. The entire operating system of the planet has been compromised by the time virus introduced by the Watchers. The world is not just misbehaving, it is malfunctioning at a core level. From this heavenly vantage point, the flood is not merely an act of punishment. It is a cosmic, hard reset. You do not try to repair a computer system riddled with a virus so deep that it has corrupted the master clock and rewritten the core code. You do not risk leaving fragments of the malicious code behind. You wipe the hard drive completely. You erase everything and reinstall the original, clean operating system. The flood was God's act of wiping the hard drive of creation. It was a radical, necessary measure to purge the world of the chaotic, discordant rhythms that had been set in motion. It was the only way to silence the false clocks and restore the potential for the one true rhythm to be heard again. It was less an act of anger and more an act of cosmic surgery, excruciating. Yes, but essential to save the patient from a terminal disease. Genesis shows us the water. Jubilees reveals its true purpose to wash away not just the sinners, but the very memory of the broken time they served. The hard reset of the flood cleansed the earth. But what of the architects of the chaos? What of the celestial guardians who betrayed their sacred trust? A judgment that only punished humanity would be an incomplete one. The true culprits, the ones who had introduced the virus in the first place, had to face a reckoning of their own. And their sentence, as described in the ancient texts of Jubilees and Enoch, was a masterpiece of divine justice. It was a punishment perfectly, poetically, and terrifyingly tailored to the nature of their crime. Think of what they had done. They had taken a world bathed in the light of God's perfect, orderly time and plunged it into the darkness of temporal chaos. They had unmoored creation from the fixed, predictable cycles of heaven and set it adrift in a confusing twilight of their own making. They were thieves of light and order, and so their verdict was this: they would be bound in chains of darkness. This was not a physical prison of rock and iron. It was a metaphysical confinement. They were seized by the loyal archangels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and cast into the abyss, a realm defined by the very qualities they had inflicted upon the world. They were severed from the light of God's presence. They were cut off from the celestial rhythms they once guarded. They, who once navigated the starways and understood the grand clockwork of the cosmos, were now imprisoned in a timeless, lightless void, to be held there until the final day of judgment. Their punishment was an exact and horrifying mirror of their sin. They stole time, so they were cast into a place where time has no meaning. They extinguished the light of order, so they were condemned to an eternity without light. The books describe them crying out, their pleas for mercy echoing unanswered in a prison of their own making. This dual judgment, water for the earth, Darkness for the heavens is the missing key to the entire saga. It proves that God's justice is absolute and impartial. It reaches not only the corrupted foot soldier, but the treasonous general. No rank, no station, no celestial origin provides immunity. The gatekeepers of history may have tried to reduce this story to a simple morality tale about human sin, but the chaining of the Watchers stands as an eternal testament to the truth. This was a heavenly crime, and it demanded a heavenly sentence. The flood was over. The hard drive had been wiped. The corrupting agents, the Watchers, were bound in darkness. Noah and his family stepped out of the ark onto the soil of a cleansed and silent world. It was a new beginning, a fresh installation of the original operating system. But anyone who has ever dealt with a deeply embedded computer virus knows a chilling truth sometimes, even after a full system wipe. Fragments of the malicious code can survive. A ghost in the machine, a lingering piece of corrupted data hidden away in a forgotten partition, waiting for the right moment to replicate itself again. The scriptures, in their haunting and often brutal honesty, hint that the cosmic reset was not entirely complete. Genesis 6:4 contains one of the most terrifying phrases in the entire Bible. A phrase that hangs in the air like an unresolved chord. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, after the judgment, after the cleansing, after the world was supposed to have been made new. The genetic echo of the Watchers' rebellion, the living embodiment of a fractured reality, somehow survived the purge. The Bible doesn't specify how, perhaps through the bloodline of one of the wives on the ark, as some traditions suggest, but its survival is a fact. The giants would return to haunt the pages of Israel's history, a constant physical reminder of the old corruption. But a far more subtle and dangerous echo also endured. It wasn't just a genetic ghost, it was a mimetic one. The idea, the memory of the false rhythms, the allure of the lunar cycles, the temptation to control time for human purposes. The virus of the counterfeit calendar was not completely eradicated. The war was not over. The Great Flood was not the final victory. It was merely the end of the first great battle. The conflict between the two paradigms of time, the perfect solar calendar of God versus the pliable, lunar calendars of men, would become the secret, undeclared war of all subsequent human history. The legacy of the Watchers' original crime would continue to bubble up from the depths, an unending challenge to the divine order. The ghost in the machine was still active, and its greatest victory would not be won on a battlefield with giants, but in the quiet council chambers where the new gatekeepers would decide which version of history you were allowed to read. Our investigation has led us from a cosmic crime scene to the heart of a divine conspiracy. We've identified the victim, the calendar of God. We've identified the original crime, an attack on time itself. We've seen how a story of cosmic sabotage was repackaged into a simpler tale of lust. This leaves us with the final, and perhaps most uncomfortable, phase of our inquiry. We must now turn our attention from the what to the who. Who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to take the explosive testimony of the Book of Jubilees, this angelic record of creation's true history, and bury it? Who had the authority to declare it unofficial, to label it apocrypha? and to effectively erase it from the memory of Western civilization. The culprits are not a single villain in a dark cloak. They are a system, an institution. We must now issue an indictment against the very figures history has taught us to trust, the gatekeepers. These are the scribes, the scholars, the translators, and the influential leaders who gathered at the great councils of the early church and in the rabbinic schools, councils like Nicaea, Laodicea, and Jamnia. These were the men who took upon themselves the monumental task of standardizing the faith. They were the ones who decided which books would be included in the biblical canon and, more importantly, which books would be left out. Their stated mission was to protect the flock from heresy, to create a unified, stable, and easily understandable doctrine. They were the architects of orthodox belief, and their intentions, we can assume, were often sincere. They sought to build a fortress of faith that could withstand the storms of a hostile world. But in their pursuit of order, they made a fatal calculation. They looked upon the wild, untamed truths within the Book of Jubilees, the celestial calendar, the angelic crime against time, the cosmic war predating Adam, and they saw not a deeper revelation, but a dangerous liability. It was too complex. It was too unsettling. It asked too many questions that would challenge the new religious structures they were so carefully building. And so, in a decision that would alter the course of spiritual history, they chose order over truth. They chose control over revelation. They became the very thing they were supposed to guard against. The protectors of the sacred texts became their censors. Every indictment requires a motive. It's not enough to name the suspects. We must understand why they committed the crime. Why would these sincere, intelligent, and often devout men, the architects of modern faith, make the deliberate choice to bury a text as profound as the Book of Jubilees? Was it out of pure, malicious evil? The truth is far more subtle and, in many ways, far more damning. They did not silence the calendar of God because they were evil. They silenced it because they were pragmatic. They silenced it in the name of control. Let's return to the core of the problem. As we established, a perfect solar 364-day calendar is a revolutionary tool of spiritual empowerment. It is a system that runs itself. It requires no priestly class to interpret its complexities because it has none. Any farmer who can mark the solstice on a rock can know the appointed times of God. The divine rhythm is self-evident, accessible to all. It creates a direct, unmediated covenant between the individual and the Creator. Now, place yourself in the shoes of a religious leader in the tumultuous centuries after Christ, or a rabbi trying to hold a scattered people together after the destruction of the temple. Your world is chaos. You are fighting heresies on all sides. Your primary goal is to create unity, structure, and a clear chain of command. You need a system that reinforces the authority of the institution, not one that renders it irrelevant. The lunar-based calendars they had inherited and adapted were the perfect tool for this. They were complex. They required official sanction. The dating of the most important festival of the year, Easter or Passover, became a matter of fierce debate and conciliar decrees. The calendar became an instrument of institutional power. By controlling the when of worship, they solidified their control over the how and the what. The Book of Jubilees, with its radical, decentralized calendar of God, was a direct threat to this new model of authority. It was a declaration that the institution was, at best, a helpful guide, but not an essential intermediary. It suggested that the very foundation of their sacred year might be built on a man-made compromise rather than a divine mandate. It was, in short, a truth too wild to tame, too liberating to control. And so, for the sake of unity and for the consolidation of their own authority, the gatekeepers made a choice. They buried the blueprint. They declared the original clock to be broken and presented their own, more pliable version as the only one that worked. It was an act of cosmic identity theft, committed not with a bang, but with the quiet scratching of a scribe's pen, redacting a truth they could no longer afford to believe, a crime committed thousands of years ago, a decision made in a dusty council chamber. It all feels so distant, so academic. But the core principle of our investigation is that the past is never truly past. A crime scene, even one that is millennia old, leaves a legacy. A silence, when held for long enough, creates a void. And we, today, are living in that void. So what is the lasting inheritance of this silenced crime? What is the consequence of erasing the calendar of God from our collective spiritual memory? It has left us with a faith that feels, for many, subtly incomplete. It has created a spiritual life that is often unmoored from the physical world. We are taught to connect with God through prayer, through scripture, through inner contemplation, all of which are essential. But we have forgotten how to connect with Him through the rhythms of His own creation. We no longer feel the turning of the seasons as the turning of a sacred page in His divine almanac. The solstices and equinoxes, once the great pillars of the holy year, have become mere astronomical footnotes or pagan holidays. The result is a profound sense of spiritual disorientation, a nagging feeling that we are missing something essential, a deeper harmony that we can sense but cannot find. We are like musicians trying to play a grand symphony, but we have been given a corrupted and incomplete musical score. We play the right notes, we say the right words, but the divine rhythm, the original tempo, is lost to us. We are playing out of time. This is the true legacy of the gatekeepers' choice. In their quest for order and control, they inadvertently severed our connection to the heartbeat of creation. They left us like heirs to a magnificent palace, but locked the doors to the grand ballroom, the observatory, and the clock tower, telling us that the small handful of rooms they left open were all that ever existed. We live in a fraction of our spiritual inheritance, unaware of the vast rhythmic architecture that lies just beyond the walls of our approved doctrines. This feeling of loss, this quiet ache for a deeper connection, is not a failure of your faith. It is the echo of a silenced truth, the ghost of a stolen rhythm, still humming just beneath the surface of our modern world. Our investigation is now complete. We have followed the evidence from a cosmic crime scene to the heart of an ancient conspiracy. We have examined the testimony of the witnesses, both the official and the silenced. We have identified the true victim, the calendar of God. We have exposed the original crime, an attack on time itself, and we have presented a motive for why this explosive truth was buried. The file is now open on the table before you. The redacted pages have been restored. The sealed tomb has been unsealed. My role in this process is now over. I am not a judge. I am not here to tell you what you must believe or what you must do. My role as the investigator was simply to uncover the evidence that they tried to hide and to present it to you, the jury, as clearly as I can. And now, the verdict is yours. You stand at a threshold. Behind you is the comfortable, familiar room of the story you have always known. A story made safe and manageable by the gatekeepers. Before you is an open door leading into the vast, wild, and awe-inspiring architecture of a much larger reality. The choice you face is not a simple one. To ignore the evidence and quietly close the door is the easier path. It requires nothing of you. It allows you to continue living within the familiar walls, undisturbed. But to step through that door, that requires courage. It requires a willingness to question. It requires a commitment to seek a truth that may not be comfortable or convenient. It means choosing to move from a faith that is inherited to a faith that is actively investigated. It means taking back the authority that the gatekeepers claimed for themselves and deciding that you have a right to read the original blueprint for yourself. The key has been turned. The door is ajar. The forgotten rhythm of creation is faintly audible from the other side. You no longer have the luxury of blissful ignorance. You now know that a room has been locked. The only question left is this: will you dare to step inside? This is not the end of a video. It is the beginning of a journey. If you choose to step across that threshold, you are not simply choosing to believe a new set of facts about the ancient past. You are choosing to embark on a personal journey of restoration. It is a journey to reclaim a lost inheritance, to relearn a forgotten language, to resynchronize your own life with the divine heartbeat of the universe. This path is not about condemning the past or rejecting the sincere faith of those who came before us. It is not about anger or division. It is about a quiet, deliberate, and joyful act of recovery. It is about learning to see the world not as a random collection of days on a man-made grid, but as a sacred and repeating symphony of appointed times. It is about watching the sun rise, not just as the start of another workday, but as a celestial marker in a divine story. It is about transforming your faith from a set of doctrines you agree with into a lived reality you participate in, moment by moment, season by season. And you are not alone on this journey. All around the world, the keys are turning. The sealed books are being opened. The voices that were silenced are beginning to speak again. A great awakening is taking place, as people are being called out of the comfortable rooms of inherited religion and into the wild, open air of recovered truth. Your journey begins now. It begins with a choice to listen, to observe, to ask the questions that have been forbidden, to seek the rhythm that was stolen. The clock that was erased from the Bible is beginning to tick once more, not in a dusty scroll, but in the hearts of those who have the courage to hear it. The evidence has been presented. The verdict is yours. The journey is waiting. Welcome to the truth. Unredacted.